The first time my mom called my job cute, I laughed. Not because it was funny, because laughing felt easier than unpacking what she really meant. We were sitting in her kitchen, the same one I grew up in, with the same faded curtains and the same tone of voice she always used when she didn't quite take me seriously. "So," she said, stirring her coffee, "you're still at that little job?" I nodded. "I work full-time," I said. 15 an hour, she replied, smiling. That's cute. The word landed softly but carried weight. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. It was dismissive in a way that felt practiced. As if my effort was a phase. As if my work existed for character building, not survival. I told myself not to read into it. I always did. I reminded myself that I paid my rent on time. That I showed up every day. That I worked hard, even when the work wasn't glamorous or impressive enough to brag about at family gatherings. I didn't need her validation. At least that's what I told myself. Weeks passed. Life stayed tight but manageable. Budgeting was a constant background task. Groceries were planned. Extras were rare. Every dollar had a job before it even arrived. I was careful because I had to be. No safety net. No cushion. Just consistency and discipline. Then the call came. Late afternoon. Her name on my screen. I answered without thinking. "Hey, honey," she said, voice lighter than usual. "I wanted to ask you something." I leaned against the counter in my apartment, already bracing. "What's up?" She hesitated just long enough to matter. "Do you think you could loan me some money?" The words felt unreal at first. I waited for the punchline. It didn't come. "How much?" I asked carefully. "Just a few thousand," she said quickly. "Temporary. I'll pay you back." My chest tightened. A few $1,000s wasn't temporary in my world. It was months of rent. It was groceries and gas and utilities stacked together. It was the difference between breathing and panic. I thought about the way she'd smiled when she called my job cute. The way she'd dismissed $15 an hour like it was a hobby. "And what happened?" I asked. She sighed. "Things are a little tight right now." The irony hit me so hard I almost laughed again. Tight. That was the word she used when I had lived tight my entire adult life. "What's it for?" I asked. She shifted. "Well, your uncle needs help. And there was an unexpected expense. And I don't want to put it on a credit card." Pictured my bank account automatically, the numbers etched into my brain from years of checking and rechecking. "I don't really have that kind of money," I said slowly. There it was. The pause. The subtle disappointment. "But you work all the time," she said. "You don't have kids. Your expenses can't be that high." The sentence stung more than I expected. As if my life didn't count because it wasn't complicated enough to impress her. "I make $15 an hour," I reminded her. "Right," she said. "That's why it's impressive you've saved anything at all." Impressive. Like a trick. Like something surprising. I closed my eyes. This wasn't just about money. It was about how easily she assumed access to what I worked so hard to protect. She didn't ask if it was possible. She assumed it was reasonable. Because to her, my job was cute, but my savings were apparently serious enough to bail her out. "I need to think about it," I said. Her tone changed immediately. "Well, I just thought family helps family," she replied. There it was. The line. The one that always arrived when boundaries appeared. Family helps family. But only in one direction. I hung up after a few polite excuses, my hand shaking slightly as I set the phone down. I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, replaying the conversation. The way she minimized my work. The way she maximized my responsibility. The way she never once asked how I was managing. Only what I could give. That was the moment something shifted. Not anger. Clarity. I realized that to her, my job was cute until it became useful. And I was tired of being underestimated until I was needed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the money, but because of the realization that settled into me like a weight I hadn't noticed before. My mom didn't see my job as real labor. She saw it as something temporary, something light, something that existed until I moved on to what she considered real life. And yet, she had no problem counting on the results of that labor when it suited her. I lay on my couch, phone face down on the coffee table, replaying her voice in my head. Just a few thousand. As if that phrase meant the same thing to both of us. I opened my banking app, not because I didn't know the numbers, but because seeing them grounded me in reality. Every deposit had a story. Every bit of savings was the result of overtime, skipped meals, saying no to things I wanted but couldn't afford. That money wasn't excess. It was security. It was the thin line between stability and panic. I thought back to all the times she had brushed off my work. Family dinners where relatives asked what I did, and she answered for me with a laugh. She works at this little place downtown. Nothing fancy. The way she'd changed the subject quickly, steering conversations back to my cousin's promotions or my brother's plans. I used to tell myself it didn't matter. That pride didn't pay bills. But now I saw how that dismissal shaped expectations. If my job was cute, then my money must be extra. Disposable. Available. I wondered if she had any idea what $15 an hour actually meant after taxes. How carefully it had to be managed. How one unexpected expense could unravel months of planning. The thought made my stomach twist. I rolled onto my side and stared at the wall, counting the cracks I'd never noticed before. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What did my family actually see when they looked at me? Not what I hoped they saw. Not what I wished they saw. But what their actions revealed. They saw someone dependable. Someone resilient. Someone who could figure it out. Which sounded like praise but functioned like permission to withdraw support. The next morning, my mom texted. A simple message. Any chance you've thought about it? No greeting. No concern. Just the ask. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. I could already feel the familiar urge to soften the situation. To apologize for not being more helpful. To explain myself until my reasons sounded small enough to be dismissed. I stopped. I set the phone down. I went to work. All day, my mind moved between tasks automatically, but my thoughts stayed anchored to that message. I watched customers complain about minor inconveniences while I smiled and fixed their problems. I thought about how often I did that in my own life. How often I smoothed things over for people who didn't consider the cost to me. During my lunch break, I sat outside with a cheap sandwich and did the math again. What lending that money would mean. What it would erase. What it would risk. I imagined the stress of waiting to be paid back. The awkward reminders. The unspoken resentment if it didn't come quickly. I imagined needing help myself one day and hearing silence on the other end of the line. That picture felt far too familiar. By the end of my shift, my decision was forming, solid, and uncomfortable. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared about myself enough to stop pretending my limits were negotiable. When I got home, I finally picked up my phone. Typed slowly, deliberately. I've thought about it, I wrote. I can't loan you that amount. I don't have the margin. I stared at the message for a long moment before sending it. My chest felt tight but steady. This wasn't impulsive. This was honest. Her reply came faster than I expected. Oh. Just that. Then another message followed. I guess I thought you'd be able to help more by now. The words hit like a quiet accusation. By now. As if there was a timeline I'd failed to meet. as if my progress was measured by how useful I was to her. I took a deep breath and didn't respond. That silence felt different from all the other times I'd gone quiet. It wasn't avoidance. It was boundary. And once I felt it, I knew I couldn't go back. After I sent that message, something inside me stayed alert. Not anxious. Not panicked. Alert. Like my body finally understood that something important had happened and refused to let it fade away. I went through the next few days with an unusual awareness of my surroundings. The sound of the bus brakes in the morning. The way the floor creaked in my apartment when I walked barefoot at night. The weight of my keys in my hand when I locked the door behind me. Everything felt sharper, as if my senses were recalibrating to a new reality. I kept thinking about how casually my mother had asked for the loan. No build-up. No hesitation. No acknowledgement of what that money represented to me. Just an assumption. And assumptions don't come from nowhere. They're built over time, reinforced by patterns, by unspoken agreements that everyone pretends don't exist. I started replaying moments from the past that suddenly made more sense. Times when I'd mentioned working double shifts and she'd responded with, "That's good for you. Keeps you busy." Times when I'd talked about being tired and she'd said, "You're young. You have energy." Times when I'd worried about money and she'd brushed it off with, "It'll work itself out." Those phrases weren't comforting. They were distancing. They positioned my struggle as something abstract, something theoretical, something that didn't require intervention. And because I never pushed back, they became the foundation for how she saw me. Capable. Low risk. Self-sustaining. Which, in her mind, meant available. I realized then that my mother didn't see my job as cute because it was small. She saw it as cute because it didn't threaten her sense of hierarchy. It didn't challenge her worldview. In her mind, real work looked like something with prestige attached to it. Titles. Salaries she could brag about. Jobs that sounded impressive at dinner parties. My work didn't fit that narrative, so it was minimized. But money earned quietly, consistently, without fanfare still spends the same. And that's where the contradiction lived. My labor wasn't worthy of respect, but its results were fair game. That realization followed me everywhere. At work, I watched my manager juggle schedules and complaints, absorbing stress that no one ever acknowledged. I thought about how much invisible labor exists in the world. How many people hold systems together without recognition. And how often those same people are expected to give more because they can handle it. That afternoon, I overheard a coworker joking about how her parents still helped her with rent. She laughed as she said it, a little embarrassed but also grateful. Something in my chest tightened. Not out of jealousy. Out of clarity. I wasn't bitter that my parents couldn't help me. I was exhausted by the way they pretended I didn't need help at all. When I got home, I sat at my small kitchen table and opened my laptop. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I felt compelled to see my life on paper. I pulled up a spreadsheet and began listing everything I paid for myself. Rent, utilities, transportation, food, insurance, emergency savings, student loans. Every line item represented something I carried alone. I stared at the total monthly number and felt a strange mix of pride and grief. Pride because I was doing it. Grief because I shouldn't have had to do all of it alone. That's when it hit me. My mother asking for a loan wasn't just about her situation. It was about how she perceived my role in the family ecosystem. I wasn't the child who needed protection. I was the one who filled gaps. The one who absorbed pressure. The one who could be leaned on without acknowledgement. I had been playing that role for so long that everyone assumed I was comfortable in it, including me. That night, I didn't distract myself with shows or scrolling. I sat with the discomfort. I let the anger surface fully without immediately trying to soften it. It wasn't explosive. It was heavy, dense, like wet concrete settling into place. I realized that my fear wasn't about disappointing my mother. It was about what saying no meant. Saying no meant stepping out of alignment with the version of me my family was comfortable with. It meant risking tension, awkwardness, distance, but it also meant finally aligning with myself. And that choice felt irreversible. The next day my mother called. I let it ring, then ring again, then stop. I watched the missed call notification sit on my screen, unmoving. For the first time, I didn't feel compelled to explain. I didn't feel guilty. I felt resolved. 'Cause I understood now that every time I minimized myself to keep the peace, I taught her that my needs were optional. And I was done teaching that lesson. The silence after I didn't answer her call stretched longer than I expected. Hours passed. Then a full day. And in that space, something unfamiliar happened. My nervous system began to slow down. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I wasn't actively managing it. I wasn't preparing explanations. I wasn't rehearsing apologies. I wasn't translating my limits into something easier for someone else to accept. That alone felt revolutionary. For years, my reflex had been to respond immediately, to prove availability, to show that I was reasonable, flexible, grateful. Now I was doing none of those things, and the world didn't collapse. I went to work like usual, clocked in, put on the uniform, smiled at customers, answered questions, solved problems. The normalcy of it all was grounding, because it reminded me that my life continued regardless of my mother's expectations. During a lull, I caught myself thinking about how often my value had been tied to my usefulness, not just in my family but everywhere. Be helpful, be agreeable, be easy. Those traits were praised early on, then quietly exploited later. I wondered when I had learned that being needed was safer than being seen. Probably early, probably often. I remembered being a kid, overhearing my mom on the phone with relatives. "She's so independent," she'd say about me. "She never needs anything." At the time, that sounded like admiration. Now I heard it for what it was. A narrative that absolved her from having to check in. If I never needed anything, then there was nothing she could fail to provide. That realization settled into me slowly, reshaping memories I had always accepted at face value. After my shift, I took the long way home. I walked instead of taking the bus, letting the evening air cool my thoughts. I passed families in restaurants, couples arguing quietly, kids tugging on their parents' sleeves. Everyone absorbed in their own dynamics. I realized that no family looks complicated from the outside. The complexity lives in the roles, in who is allowed to ask, in who is expected to endure. When I finally got home, there was another message from my mom waiting. This one longer, more emotional. "I didn't mean to upset you," it read. "I just thought you might be in a better position by now. You're always so responsible." The words tightened something in my chest. Responsible. There it was again. That word had followed me my entire life like a badge I never asked for. Responsible meant dependable. Responsible meant quiet. Responsible meant absorbing discomfort so others didn't have to. I read the message again, slower this time. Not to find fault, but to understand the pattern. She wasn't apologizing for asking. She was explaining why she felt justified in asking. Because of who she believed I was. And because I had allowed that belief to stand unchallenged for years. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Every version sounded like negotiation. Like compromise. Like me bending just enough to make the situation smoother for her. I stopped. I put the phone down. I made dinner. A simple meal. Nothing fancy. The act of feeding myself felt intentional, grounding. I ate slowly, letting the weight of my decision settle in my body. I wasn't being cruel. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being accurate. Later that night, I finally replied. I understand why you asked, I wrote. But I can't take on that responsibility. My job may look cute to you, but it's how I survive. I need my savings to stay afloat. I stared at the message before sending it. Felt firm. Clear. Unapologetic. I hit send. The response didn't come right away. When it did, it was shorter than before. I didn't realize you felt that way. That sentence carried more weight than she probably intended, because it confirmed something I'd already suspected. She hadn't realized. She hadn't noticed. She hadn't asked. Not because she didn't care at all, but because my quiet competence had made it easy not to look closer. I put my phone away and sat with that truth. Caring isn't just a feeling. It's attention. And attention had always flowed away from me. That night, I slept better than I had in days. Not deeply, but peacefully. Because for the first time, I wasn't betraying myself to maintain an image. I was choosing honesty over harmony. And that choice, while uncomfortable, felt like the beginning of something solid. In the days that followed, I noticed how much mental space had been occupied by my mother's expectations without me ever consciously inviting them in. It was like discovering a background noise that had always been there, humming quietly, shaping my reactions, my choices, my tone. Once I heard it clearly, I couldn't unhear it. Every decision suddenly felt sharper, more deliberate. I found myself questioning old habits. Why did I feel the urge to justify my expenses to no one? Why did I mentally rehearse explanations for how I spent my time? Why did I still flinch at the idea of being seen as ungrateful for protecting myself? Those reflexes hadn't come from nowhere. They were learned, earned through repetition, conditioned by years of being praised for endurance and minimized for need. At work, the contrast became impossible to ignore. My supervisor thanked me for staying late. A coworker noticed I looked tired and asked if I was okay. Small moments of recognition landed differently now, 'cause they highlighted what had been missing at home. Recognition without obligation. Concern without a price. I realized that I had been accepting crumbs in one area of my life because I was starving for acknowledgement in another. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Sad for the younger version of myself who believed that being low maintenance was the same as being lovable. Sad for the countless times I swallowed discomfort because it felt easier than disrupting the balance. That weekend, I finally let myself do something I'd always postponed. I reviewed my finances honestly, without guilt or shame. I laid everything out: income, expenses, savings, goals. For the first time, I wasn't framing my money as something I might need to defend or surrender. I framed it as protection, as choice, as evidence of my discipline. And I felt proud. Not in a loud way. In a steady, grounded way. I realized how fragile my safety net actually was. One medical bill. One job disruption. One unexpected emergency. That money my mother had called extra was the difference between coping and collapsing. Understanding that made my decision feel not just justified, but necessary. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Another message from her. I didn't sleep well, it read. I keep thinking maybe I said the wrong thing. The sentence pulled at something in me. Not enough to undo my boundary, but enough to acknowledge that this wasn't villainy. It was blindness. Kind that develops when someone grows used to a story where they're always the provider and never the one who takes. I typed back slowly. I don't think you meant harm, I wrote. But calling my work cute made me feel small. And asking for money after that made it worse. I paused. Then added one more line. I need you to respect that my job is real to me. I sent it before I could overthink. The reply took longer this time. When it came, it was careful. "I didn't realize my words affected you like that," she wrote. "I was just teasing." Teasing. That word carried its own kind of dismissal, as if intent erased impact. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I let the message sit unanswered. 'Cause I understood something important now. Not every misunderstanding needs resolution to be resolved internally. Sometimes clarity is enough. That evening, I went for a walk as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in muted colors. I thought about how many times I'd stayed quiet to avoid being labeled sensitive or dramatic. How often I'd chosen silence over self-respect. The air felt cooler against my skin, grounding me in the present moment. I reminded myself that boundaries aren't punishments. They're information. They tell people where you end and where they begin. And if someone feels hurt by that, it doesn't automatically mean you're wrong. Back in my apartment, I cooked a simple dinner and ate without distraction. No phone. No background noise. Just the clink of utensils and my own thoughts. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fill the quiet. Quiet felt earned. I realized that my mother's request had done something unexpected. It had forced me to see my own worth clearly. Not through her eyes. Through my own. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I went to bed that night with a strange sense of calm. Kind that comes not from resolution, but from alignment. I knew the situation wasn't over. I knew there would be more conversations, more tension, more adjustment. But I also knew this. I wasn't going to shrink to make anyone else comfortable ever again. The calm didn't mean the situation was finished. It meant I had stopped fighting myself. And that difference changed how everything landed. A few days later, my mom called again. This time, I answered. Not out of obligation. Out of curiosity. I wanted to hear her tone when she knew I wasn't bending. "Hi," she said, softer than usual. I could hear something unfamiliar underneath her voice. Uncertainty. "I've been thinking about what you said." I didn't respond right away. I let the silence exist. It wasn't strategic. It was honest. "I didn't realize you were struggling like that," she continued. That sentence sat between us, heavy and incomplete. 'Cause it wasn't quite accountability. It was surprise. As if my stability had always been assumed rather than observed. "I don't talk about it much," I said finally. "Because whenever I do, it gets minimized." She sighed. "I never meant to minimize you. I believed that. But belief didn't erase the pattern. Intent had never matched impact. And I was done pretending it did." "I know," I replied. "But that's what happened." Another pause. Longer this time. "I guess I thought you were doing better than that," she said carefully. There it was again. Better than that. As if survival existed on a ladder. As if there was a correct rung I was supposed to reach by a certain age. "I'm doing exactly as well as my circumstances allow," I said. "And I'm proud of that." The words surprised even me. Not because they weren't true. Because I'd never said them out loud before. She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice sounded different. Less assured. "I didn't know," she repeated. And this time it felt closer to truth. We talked for a few more minutes. About neutral things. The weather. A neighbor. Nothing about the loan. Nothing about money. When we hung up, I felt drained but steady. Not victorious. Just realigned. Later that week, I noticed how my relationship with work shifted. Not the job itself, but how I viewed it. For so long, I'd internalized the idea that my work wasn't impressive enough to matter. That it was a placeholder. A stepping stone. Something to outgrow. Now I saw it differently. Paid my bills. It required skill, patience, and consistency. It was real. That reframing didn't make the job glamorous, but it made it valid. And that validation didn't come from my mother. Came from me. One evening, a coworker asked if I wanted to grab a drink after work. I almost said no out of habit. Then I caught myself. I said yes. We sat at a cheap bar, laughing about customers and managers and the strange intimacy of shared stress. At some point, she mentioned how her parents still bailed her out when money got tight. She said it casually, without guilt. I listened without resentment, because comparison had lost its grip on me. Her life wasn't a judgment on mine. It was just different. Walking home that night, I realized something subtle but powerful. I had spent years trying to prove my adulthood to my family. Through responsibility. Through sacrifice. Through silence. And yet, adulthood isn't something you earn through suffering. Something you claim through self-trust. My mother called again a few days later. This time, she didn't ask for money. She asked how I was. It was awkward. Halting. But it was new. I answered honestly without performing resilience. "I'm okay," I said. Still figuring things out. She didn't rush to reassure me. She didn't dismiss it. She just listened. That moment mattered more than any apology she could have offered. 'Cause it showed adjustment. Not perfection. But movement. I knew things wouldn't change overnight. Decades of dynamics don't dissolve after one boundary. But something had shifted. And more importantly, something in me had settled. I no longer felt the need to over-explain my choices. I no longer framed my life as temporary or lesser. I existed fully in it. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how easily money reveals power dynamics. Who is expected to give? Who is expected to endure? Who is allowed to need without shame? My mother's request had forced those questions into the open. And once exposed, they couldn't be hidden again. I understood now that the real conflict wasn't about a loan. It was about respect. About whether my life was seen as legitimate without comparison. About whether my effort was valued even when it wasn't impressive by external standards. For the first time, I felt like I was standing on my own side. Not waiting for approval. Not bracing for disappointment. Just present. Just grounded. Just done minimizing myself to make other people comfortable. What surprised me most wasn't my mother's reaction. It was how differently I reacted to it. In the past, any hint of tension would have sent me into overdrive. Explaining. Justifying. Softening my words until they barely resembled what I meant. This time, I didn't chase reassurance. I didn't replay the call obsessively. I let it exist as it was. Incomplete. Imperfect. And strangely enough, that restraint gave me room to notice everything else I'd been ignoring. I noticed how much of my day-to-day life had been shaped by the assumption that I needed to prove myself worthy of rest. Worthy of enjoyment. Worthy of stability. I noticed how often I delayed small pleasures because they felt undeserved. How often I treated my own needs like luxuries. That awareness wasn't comfortable. It was humbling. 'Cause it meant admitting that I had internalized the same hierarchy my family operated under. I had been enforcing it on myself. That weekend, I cleaned my apartment slowly, deliberately. Not out of obligation. Out of care. I rearranged furniture. Opened windows. Let fresh air move through rooms that had always felt temporary, like I wasn't supposed to get too attached. I realized I'd lived that way emotionally too. Never settling fully. Always preparing to pivot. Always assuming something better was expected of me somewhere else someday. I sat on the floor afterward, surrounded by half-empty boxes I'd never unpacked because I told myself I wouldn't be here long. I laughed quietly at the irony. I'd stayed longer than I thought. And I was still waiting for permission to belong. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. A photo. Not of a bill. Not of paperwork. A picture of the sunset from her backyard. "Thought you might like this," she wrote. It was simple. Almost innocent. I stared at it for a long moment, unsure how to interpret it. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a request. It was an attempt at connection without leverage. That mattered. I replied with a single sentence. "It's beautiful." No more. No less. The exchange felt balanced. Later, as I lay in bed, I realized something else. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't anticipating guilt. I wasn't rehearsing defenses. I was present. That presence changed how I remembered the past. Not rewriting it. Recontextualizing it. I saw how many times I had mistaken tolerance for love. How often I had equated endurance with maturity. How easily I had accepted the idea that needing less made me better. Truth was simpler and harder. I had learned to be small because it made other people comfortable. And comfort had always been the currency of our family. Whoever disrupted it paid the price. I thought back to the moment my mother called my job cute. At the time, I laughed it off. Now I saw it clearly. It wasn't just about the job. It was about control. As long as my work was framed as insignificant, my independence could be dismissed. And if my independence was dismissed, my boundaries could be questioned. That framing benefited everyone but me. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And more importantly, I couldn't play along anymore. The following week, something unexpected happened. My mother mentioned my job to a relative in front of me. "She works really hard," she said. "She's very disciplined." The words were careful, almost rehearsed. I didn't react outwardly, but inside I felt the shift. Not because the praise mattered, 'cause the narrative was changing. Slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. And that change hadn't come from convincing her. Came from refusing to participate in my own minimization. That realization was powerful, because it meant I didn't need to manage anyone else's perception of me. I just needed to stop contradicting myself. I began making decisions with that clarity in mind. Small ones. Choosing rest without guilt. Bending modestly without apology. Saying no without a speech. Choice reinforced the same message. My life didn't need to be impressive to be valid. My work didn't need to be prestigious to be real. My boundaries didn't need to be dramatic to be firm. I understood now that respect isn't something you demand. Something you stop negotiating away. And once you do that, people either adjust or reveal themselves. Either outcome brings truth. As the days passed, I felt something solidify inside me. Not confidence. Not defiance. Ownership. I owned my circumstances. My limits. My pace. And that ownership felt steadier than any approval I'd chased before. I knew there were still conversations ahead. Still tension to navigate. Still discomfort waiting on the horizon. But I also knew this. I wasn't walking into those moments unprotected anymore. I had built something stronger than compliance. I had built self-respect. And that changed everything. By the time the next month rolled around, the shift inside me had stopped feeling fragile. It wasn't something I had to concentrate on maintaining anymore. It had settled into my posture, my tone, the way I moved through conversations without rehearsing them in advance. I noticed it first in the smallest places. At work, when a customer snapped at me and I didn't internalize it. When a supervisor made an offhand comment and I didn't shrink or compensate. When I clocked out and didn't carry the day home like unfinished business. That steadiness hadn't come from external validation. Came from finally standing in my own corner. My mother noticed it too, even if she didn't have language for it yet. Our calls became shorter. Less loaded. She asked fewer questions that doubled as evaluations. I answered more plainly, without padding my words to soften their impact. There was an awkwardness at first, like two people relearning how to talk without an old script. But beneath that awkwardness was something more honest. Face. Distance that wasn't hostile, just clear. One afternoon, she mentioned money again. Not the loan. Just money in general. "I don't know how you do it," she said. "Everything costs so much now." Comment was casual, almost reflective. Not dismissive. Not teasing. I recognized it for what it was. An acknowledgement she hadn't offered before. "It's not easy," I replied. "But it's doable if you're careful." She hummed in response. No contradiction. No minimizing. That silence spoke louder than any apology. I realized then that this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about changing the rules of engagement. I was no longer the child whose struggles were theoretical. I was an adult with constraints that deserved to be taken seriously. And even if she never fully grasped the weight of that, I did. That was enough. Around that time, an unexpected expense hit. My car needed repairs. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to sting. I paid for it without panic. Without borrowing. Without calling anyone for help. As I drove away from the mechanic, receipt tucked into my glove compartment, I felt a surge of something close to pride. Not because I had handled it alone, but because I no longer felt ashamed that I might have needed help if things were different. The shame had lifted. That mattered more than the money itself. Later that week, I met a friend for coffee. We talked about work, relationships, the usual things. At some point, she mentioned how her parents had recently loaned her money without hesitation. She said it casually, without realizing how loaded the topic was for me. I listened without resentment. I felt something else instead. Acceptance. Not of inequality, but of reality. Every family distributes support differently. That truth didn't absolve my parents, but it freed me from constantly measuring my life against someone else's framework. I walked home afterward, thinking about how often I'd equated fairness with love. How I'd believed that if love existed, fairness would follow. What I understood now was more complicated. Love can exist without fairness, and fairness can exist without warmth. Neither guarantees the other. Understanding that allowed me to release expectations that had quietly exhausted me for years. That evening, my mother called unexpectedly. Not to ask for anything. Not to comment on my life. Just to talk. She told me about a neighbor. A show she'd been watching. A recipe she'd tried. Felt almost surreal. Like we were interacting without the weight of unspoken roles pressing down on us. At one point, she paused and said, "I worry sometimes." I waited. "About you," she added. The admission was small, but it mattered. "I know you handle things on your own," she continued. "But I guess I forget that it doesn't mean it's easy." The words landed softly. Not as an apology. Not as a confession. But as awareness. "I don't need things to be easy," I said. "I just need them to be acknowledged." She didn't argue. She didn't deflect. She said, "I'm trying." That was enough. Not as a resolution. As a step. After the call, I sat quietly, letting the moment settle. I didn't rush to interpret it as a turning point. I didn't elevate it into something bigger than it was. I accepted it at face value. And that acceptance felt balanced. Because I wasn't hinging my sense of worth on whether she followed through perfectly. I had already claimed that for myself. As the weeks passed, I continued to live deliberately. I saved where I could. I rested where I needed to. I stopped apologizing for the scale of my life. I stopped treating my effort like a placeholder for something better. I started honoring it as the foundation it actually was. The job that had once been called cute became something else entirely in my own mind. Became proof. Proof that consistency matters. Proof that dignity doesn't require prestige. Proof that survival deserves respect. And in that reframing, I felt something loosen inside me. The need to prove. The urge to defend. The habit of shrinking. They all began to fade. I understood now that my mother's request for a loan had never been about money alone. It had been a mirror. And once I saw my reflection clearly, I couldn't look away. I didn't know exactly how our relationship would evolve from there. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never again allow my effort to be minimized simply because it wasn't impressive to someone else. That line had been drawn. And this time it wasn't going anywhere. By the time autumn settled in, the situation had shifted from something reactive to something structural. It wasn't about one conversation anymore. It was about the way my life began organizing itself around a different center. I noticed it in how I planned my weeks. I no longer built my schedule around availability for others. I built it around sustainability for myself. Work hours were chosen with intention. Rest wasn't something I squeezed in after everything else. It was something I protected. That change didn't come with fireworks. Came quietly through repetition. And that made it last. My mother and I spoke less often but more honestly. When we did talk, I didn't feel the need to update her on every detail, as if reporting progress. I shared selectively. Not to withhold, but to maintain balance. I realized how often I had overshared in the past as a way of seeking reassurance. Asking without asking if my life was acceptable. That impulse was gone now. One evening, she asked how work was going. I told her the truth. It's steady, I said. I'm learning a lot. There was no apology in my tone. No defensiveness. Just fact. She nodded on the other end of the line. That's good, she replied. No commentary. No comparison. I recognized that moment for what it was. A neutral exchange. And neutrality, after years of judgment masked as concern, felt like relief. Around that same time, a small crisis unfolded in the family. Not dramatic. Just inconvenient. Someone needed help organizing something. In the past, my phone would have rung immediately. I would have been the default. The reliable one. This time it didn't. I heard about it later, secondhand. And instead of feeling excluded, I felt free. It was the first real sign that my boundary wasn't just internal anymore. It had changed how others interacted with me. That didn't mean I was no longer dependable. It meant my dependability wasn't assumed without consent. I thought about that distinction often. Being dependable by choice versus being dependable by default. The former is empowering. The latter is draining. As my savings slowly grew again after the car repair, I felt a sense of stability that had nothing to do with numbers. Came from knowing I wouldn't hand it over just because someone expected me to. That knowledge changed how I held myself. My posture. My tone. My patience. I noticed that people responded differently to me. Not because I was louder, but because I was clearer. Clarity has a way of commanding respect without asking for it. One afternoon, my mother mentioned the loan again. Not to ask, but to acknowledge. I should have been more careful with how I talked about your job, she said. The sentence was imperfect. Didn't include an apology. But it did include recognition. I didn't think about what it costs you to save, she added. That was new. I let the words settle. I needed you to see that, I replied. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just said, I do now. That exchange mattered. Not because it fixed the past, but because it shifted the present. I realized then that my growth had created a new dynamic. One where I wasn't negotiating my worth. One where respect wasn't extracted through sacrifice. One where my life wasn't measured against someone else's expectations. That dynamic felt unfamiliar at first. Then it felt natural. As the weeks passed, I noticed how often my inner dialogue had changed. I no longer framed decisions as risks to relationships. I framed them as investments in my future. If something threatened my stability, I questioned it. Not myself. That mental shift was subtle but profound. Changed how I moved through the world. I stopped apologizing for my limits. I stopped shrinking my accomplishments to make them easier to swallow. I stopped pretending that survival wasn't work. One night, I caught my reflection in a store window as I walked home. Tired. Calm. Grounded. I didn't see someone who needed approval. I saw someone who had learned how to stand without it. That image stayed with me, because it was proof of something I'd been building quietly all along. A life where my value wasn't determined by how much I could give. A life where my job didn't need to sound impressive to be respected. A life where saying no didn't require a justification. I knew there were still parts of my family that didn't fully understand me. That might never understand me. But that no longer felt like a threat. Felt like information. And information is power. By the end of that season, I understood something deeply. The moment my mother asked me for a loan after calling my job cute wasn't a betrayal. It was a catalyst. It forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding. That my effort deserved respect regardless of how it looked to anyone else. And once I accepted that truth, everything else began to align around it. By the time winter arrived, the changes were no longer subtle. They were woven into how I lived. Not announced. Not defended. Just practiced. I woke up earlier not to prove discipline but because my mornings finally felt like mine. I planned my weeks with breathing room built in, knowing exactly how much energy I could spend without burning myself down. I stopped measuring progress by how busy I looked and started measuring it by how stable I felt. That internal recalibration made everything else quieter. Even conflict. Especially conflict. My mother noticed the shift again when she visited me for the first time in months. She stepped into my apartment and paused, taking it in. It wasn't big. It wasn't stylish. But it was intentional. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. "You've really settled in here," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. "Yes," I replied. And I meant it in a way I never had before. We sat at my small kitchen table, the same one I had once stared at while calculating whether I could afford groceries that week. Now it felt different. Not luxurious, but solid. We talked about neutral things at first. The weather. Work schedules. Nothing heavy. Then, inevitably, money came up. Not the loan. Just money as a concept. "I don't know how people manage anymore," she said, shaking her head. "Everything is so expensive." I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't minimize my own experience. "I manage because I have to," I said. "And because I plan carefully." She nodded slowly. I could see the gears turning. This wasn't the version of me she'd been picturing. This wasn't the cute job narrative. This was an adult who had built something fragile but real. Later, as she prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. "I shouldn't have joked about your job," she said quietly. The sentence hung in the air. Not polished. Not rehearsed. But sincere. I looked at her and felt no surge of vindication. No rush of triumph. Just relief. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. And I meant it. After she left, I sat alone in the quiet apartment and let the moment settle. I realized how different it felt to receive acknowledgement without having to fight for it. Didn't erase the past. But it softened it. Over the next few weeks, I noticed how often I was no longer included in family conversations about money. Not out of exclusion, out of respect. They stopped assuming I was available, stopped framing my savings as surplus, stopped treating my effort as theoretical. That change didn't come from confrontation, came from consistency, from living inside my boundary instead of announcing it. At work, I was offered extra hours. I declined some of them, not because I didn't need the money, but because I needed balance more. Saying no felt natural now. Not rebellious. Not defensive. Just practical. That practicality extended into every area of my life. I made plans months ahead instead of reacting week by week. I saved intentionally instead of fearfully. I stopped thinking of my life as temporary housing for a future version of myself. This was the future. It was happening now. One evening, I received a message from my mother that surprised me. "I told your aunt about your budgeting system," she wrote. She was impressed. I smiled at the screen. Not because it mattered that my aunt was impressed, but because my effort was finally being described accurately. Not minimized. Not romanticized. Just respected. That night, I reflected on how much energy I had spent trying to change my mother's perception of me, and how little energy it actually took once I stopped contradicting myself. People learn how to treat you by watching how you treat your own limits. I had spent years signaling that mine were flexible. Now I wasn't, and everything adjusted accordingly. I understood now that independence isn't just about surviving on your own. It's about deciding what you will and will not carry, what you will share, what you will protect. My job was still $15 an hour. That hadn't changed. But my relationship to it had. It was no longer something I defended or downplayed. It was the engine of my autonomy, and that made it powerful. As winter deepened, I felt grounded in a way I never had before. Not because life was easy, but because it was honest. And honesty, even when it's quiet, has weight. I knew that my story wasn't dramatic. There were no explosions, no ultimatums, just a slow, deliberate reclaiming of self-respect. And that kind of change lasts, because it isn't built on reaction. It's built on choice. I had chosen myself. Not loudly, not defiantly, but permanently. By the time the year began to turn again, I realized how deeply the shift had taken root. It wasn't something I had to remind myself to do. It showed up automatically in how I responded, how I paused, how I chose what to carry and what to leave behind. The biggest change wasn't external. It was internal permission. Permission to stop performing stability for people who never had to live inside it. Permission to stop translating my life into something more palatable. Permission to exist without commentary. My relationship with my mother settled into a new rhythm. Not warmer, not colder, clearer. We spoke when there was something real to say. We didn't fill silence with updates meant to reassure. She stopped asking questions that came with implied expectations. I stopped answering questions that weren't actually questions. That mutual adjustment didn't come with a conversation or agreement. It happened because I stopped accommodating confusion. When people don't get the reaction they expect, they recalibrate. I watched that recalibration happen in real time. At a family gathering, someone joked about how independent I was. In the past, I would have smiled tightly and let it pass. This time, I said nothing. I didn't correct them. I didn't lean into it. I let the comment fall flat. The silence did the work for me. Later, my mother pulled me aside and said quietly, "They don't really know what your life is like." It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't dismissive. It was observational. "I'm okay with that," I replied. And I was, 'cause understanding no longer felt like a requirement for respect. That distinction mattered. At work, my responsibilities shifted. I was trusted with more complex tasks. Not because I asked. 'Cause I was consistent. 'Cause I showed up prepared. 'Cause I knew my limits and communicated them clearly. That clarity created reliability. Not the kind that drains you, the kind that sustains you. I noticed how different that felt from being relied on out of assumption. This was earned trust, not inherited obligation. Side of work, my life became quieter. Not empty. Intentional. I spent time alone without narrating it as loneliness. I made plans based on energy instead of expectation. I let myself want things without immediately calculating whether they were reasonable. That freedom didn't make me reckless. It made me honest. One evening, my mother called unexpectedly. Not for help. Not for advice. Just to tell me she'd handled something on her own that she might have once asked me to manage. I figured it out, she said. There was a note of pride in her voice. And something else. Respect. I realized then that my boundary hadn't just changed how I was treated. It had changed how she saw herself in relation to me. She no longer saw me as an extension of her capacity. She saw me as a separate adult with limits. That shift mattered more than any apology ever could. After the call, I sat with the realization that boundaries don't just protect you. They teach other people where they stand. Not in relation to control. In relation to reality. The truth was, my mother had never intentionally tried to take advantage of me. She had simply grown used to a version of me that made things easier. And I had grown tired of being that version. That mutual adjustment didn't erase our history, but it did redefine our present. I stopped wondering if she was proud of me. Not because I didn't care. 'Cause her pride was no longer the metric. I was proud of myself. For surviving without bitterness. For standing firm without cruelty. For choosing self-respect without needing permission. That pride felt different from validation. It didn't fluctuate. It didn't require reinforcement. It simply existed. As the months passed, I watched how easily old patterns tried to resurface. Akomoy. A joke there. Each time I responded the same way. By not shrinking. By not compensating. By not explaining. Consistency did the rest. People adjusted. Or they didn't. Either way, I stayed steady. I understood now that the moment my mother asked for a loan after calling my job cute had never been about the money. It was about how easily my effort had been dismissed. How quickly my labor had been reframed as optional. How often my stability had been mistaken for surplus. Once I named that truth internally, I could no longer participate in the illusion. And without that illusion, everything aligned differently. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt finished. Finished negotiating my worth. Finished minimizing my effort. Finished confusing endurance with obligation. That sense of completion didn't close doors. It opened them. Doors to a future where my life didn't need to be impressive to be protected. Where my work didn't need to be glamorous to be respected. Where my boundaries didn't need justification. I wasn't waiting for anyone to catch up anymore. I had already moved forward. When I think about where this all began, it's strange how small the spark was. One word. Cute. Casual laugh. A request that followed too easily. The time, it felt like a misunderstanding. Something that could be smoothed over with the right explanation, the right tone, the right amount of patience. But looking back now, I see it for what it really was. A moment where the truth slipped out before anyone could dress it up. The truth that my work had been tolerated, not respected. The truth that my stability had been assumed, not protected. The truth that my effort had been invisible until it became convenient. That realization didn't explode my life. It rearranged it. Slowly. Quietly. Permanently. I didn't cut anyone off. I didn't issue ultimatums. I didn't demand apologies or repayment or recognition. I did something much harder. I stopped shrinking. I stopped performing gratitude for scraps. I stopped pretending that endurance was the same thing as love. That choice didn't make me colder. It made me clearer. And clarity has a way of settling things without force. Over time, my relationship with my mother became something I could hold without tension. Not because everything was healed, but because nothing was being denied. We spoke as two adults instead of a parent and a child stuck in old roles. She no longer framed my life as temporary or lesser. I no longer framed her approval as necessary. There was space between us now. Not distance born of resentment, distance born of definition. And within that space, respect had room to grow. I noticed how differently I felt during family conversations. Comments that once would have cut now passed through me without sticking. Not because they weren't flawed. Because they no longer defined me. I wasn't measuring myself against them anymore. I was measuring myself against my own values. Consistency, honesty, sustainability. Those were the metrics now. And by those standards, I was doing well. My job was still $15 an hour. That hadn't changed. What changed was the story attached to it. It was no longer just anything. It was my anchor. The reason I paid my bills without fear. The reason I slept without dread. The reason I didn't have to borrow peace from anyone else. I stopped apologizing for the scale of my life. Stopped framing my choices as stepping stones to something more respectable. This was respectable. This was real. This was mine. I began planning further ahead than I ever had before. Not out of anxiety. Out of confidence. I built savings slowly and deliberately. I said no to things that threatened my stability. I said yes to things that nourished me, even if they looked small from the outside. I learned that dignity doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Day by day. Choice by choice. Boundary by boundary. I thought often about how many people live their lives trying to convince others that they're doing okay. How many people downplay their exhaustion to appear capable? How many people accept being underestimated because it feels safer than being seen clearly? I had been one of them. Until I wasn't. The shift didn't make me louder. It made me steadier. And steadiness changes how people treat you. Not because they suddenly understand you, but because you stop contradicting yourself. My mother adjusted because she had to. Because the old version of me wasn't available anymore. And once she adjusted, the rest of the family followed. Not perfectly. Not immediately. But enough. Enough for me to breathe. Enough for me to stay rooted. Enough for me to stop wondering whether I was asking for too much by simply existing with needs. I realized something profound in the months that followed. Support isn't proven by what people say when things are easy. It's revealed by what they assume you can handle when things are hard. For years, my family assumed I could handle everything. And I let them. Not because I wanted to. Because I didn't know I could choose otherwise. Now I do. And that knowledge changed the trajectory of my life. I stopped confusing love with access. Stopped confusing family with obligation. Stopped confusing being needed with being valued. Those distinctions brought peace. Not the dramatic kind. The sustainable kind. The kind that doesn't require constant vigilance. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if my mother will ever fully understand the weight of what that word meant. I don't know if she'll ever look at my life and see it exactly as I do. But I know this. I don't need her to. 'Cause I see it. Clearly. Fully. Without apology. My work is real. My effort is real. My boundaries are real. And my worth has never been dependent on how impressive my life looks to someone else. The moment she asked for a loan after calling my job cute wasn't the moment I was diminished. It was the moment I stopped participating in my own minimization. And that decision changed everything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I simply chose myself. Quietly. Firmly. For good.